What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and today on the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, we have William Greenway. That's right, he's going to be talking about God. He wrote 2 books recently, A Reasonable Belief, Why God and Faith Make Sense, and The Challenge of Evil, Grace and the Problem of Suffering. And he is going to be talking about it with me right here in just a moment. So buckle your theological safety belts, because this one is going to be zesty. He is a professor of philosophical theology at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And if you don't know where that seminary is located,
I'm guessing Austin.
Well done, Nathan.
I feel like I know someone else who works there.
You do?
Yeah, I can't quite put my finger on who it might be, though.
It might be Cindy Rigby.
Oh, I wonder if they know each other.
I assume they did, since they were on staff together. And then at the end of the podcast, I found out they were married.
Well, I hope they know each other.
Yes. So, and you might notice during this podcast that Bill is not a Bardian like Cindy. So I thought, I don't know what it would be like to be married to a Bardian.
I think we should resurrect the Theology Nerd Throwdown and have a spousal edition.
I know, and I bet she's going to be like, oh my goodness. Here he goes writing entire books where he says, this isn't theological, this is philosophical spirituality, and I just want to let humans bring their experience into this reflection around the ultimate. She's going to be like, that doesn't even count as theology. Definitely not, because God didn't tell you who God is, and God's self-revelation, that is Jesus Christ. And he's like, I'm not against that. Maybe we'll do that later. I just want to talk about the way in which the world as appearance it has something lacking if you don't recognize the death dimension. And she's like, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he's like, Levinas.
Why is it? We don't need them on. You could just play both parts.
Well, today you're going to hear an excellent conversation about philosophy and God. And afterwards, when you hear it and you got questions for Bill, you're like, bring him back on the podcast, because I got to tell him this is ridiculous. Or I got to say, that is awesome, say more. Or, just holler back, because I have a high confidence that there are going to be Homebrewed Christianity listeners who will have all sorts of feels about what...
all the feels.
All the feels. You know what kind of feels I have?
Theology Beer Camp feels?
Anticipatory ones for Beer Camp. That's right. This August, Peter Rollins will be joining Homebrewed Christianity Beer Camp as we go to Denver, Colorado.
That's right. Yeah. 18th to 19th of August.
Yes. And then we're going to go to Oklahoma City.
25th and 26th of August.
It's going to be amazing. So here's the thing. I keep getting people messaging me, asking all sorts of questions, and I'm going to answer a few of them. Once you come there, you don't really pay for beer, and there's food, and you have fun. That's how it works.
You pay for dinner on the second
one
day.
of the night.
That's it.
Yeah. It's a very inclusive event. And yes, you'll have nerdy moments, fun moments, game moments, beer tasting moments,
serious moments.
Serious, like it's a wide variety of experiences. There's even a high quality ritual.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. On top of all that, I'm looking forward to letting Pete know how wrong he is.
That alone is worth the price of admission, I think.
Yeah. So I'm just going to have to set his little radical self down.
Now that you're a doctor.
Oh, I know. And he messaged me the day after I defended, because he didn't come to the defense because he would have had to have driven. Now, I grant it, he is a horrible driver. But he's like, I'm going to come. That'd be great, because I'm your friend. Never mind. I have to drive.
Yep. Not worth it.
Yeah. Well, we'll see if he comes to my birthday party. I don't know. I'm very, very sensitive.
I know.
That's why you should all come to Theology Beer Camp.
You don't want to hurt.
There's a website, theologybeercamp.com. You can also see all the different breweries that are already bringing the brews. We have if you go there and you're one of those East Coast people who are like, why is there no East Coast Beer Camp? You can tell us what city on the East Coast you want Beer Camp in, and leave us a message there, because I'm sure it'll happen. But the other thing is, I don't know if y'all have heard about this. Airplanes. And summer, Southwest Airlines does the cheap summer tickets. So if you could go to Denver or to Oklahoma City, then you can come and have the experience now. There's no need to wait. I'm just saying.
Yeah. Take advantage of that.
Yeah. But if you want to host one on the East Coast, or you want to just let someone that wants to host one know that you're there and you're ready to rock, go to theologybeercamp.com. and we'll click the little suggestion box and tell us what's up. All right. The last thing. Oh, yeah, go to Wild Goose. We're going to be there. Tell us if you want to camp with us. But the last thing is the Homebrewed Christianity Community people. We have coming up an Epic Reads. We're going to be reading an essay by Bernard Loomer. And I will introduce it, kind of tell you what's going on in it, and then we will just nerd out, all interacting video style. So if you're a member of the community, make sure you have a heads up. And if you're not, you should join us. Go to homebrewedcommunity.com, because I was trying to decide what article to do. I sent this one to Nathan, and Nathan didn't hate it.
I loved it, in fact.
No, but what do you think? I don't know.
I mean, it was really good. And it's not just because I read a bunch of Henry Nelson Wyman, who's also at the University of Chicago this past semester. But it's just a really good and powerful article, I think. He's very articulate. It's clear, easy to read, easy to understand. I don't want to give anything away, but there are not one, but two kinds of power. Two kinds of power. That's all I'm going to say. Oh, and we're going to talk about them. And then you'll have you'll be able to just name drop Loomer and stuff. He also wrote a really sweet book called The Size of God. And is it really, really big? The cover is someone doing deep and wide. But yeah. So just so you know, we have a number of exciting interviews headed your way, including one on zombies. That'll be next week, yeah. I know. And Daniel Pugh, not Daniel Pugh, Jeff Pugh. Daniel Pugh's a friend of mine from high school. Jeff Kirk, you mean? Yeah. Hey, Daniel Pugh, friend from high school. Hi. But Jeff Pugh and Daniel Kirk have an episode coming up where they talk to each other about the eschaton and the Bible and argue and stuff. Walter Brueggemann back on the pod is going to be back on the podcast. And that will be associated with the surprise. But we're not going to tell you yet. Nope. It's a secret. Shh. And I just want you to know, Twitter is very happy with the Mother's Day episode with Stephanie. So I just want to say you're welcome. I know a bunch of people said thank you. That was a great Mother's Day episode. I agree. And you're welcome. All right. This is going to be a lot of fun, this interview, and I know you're going to like it. And then you want to go to homebrewedchristianity.com so you can get links over to the books. Buy them all. Yeah. And, until next time, just share the brew. You got to share it with people. It doesn't just get distributed all by itself. Look, it's harvest time, but the workers are few. Someone said that once. All right? Does that sound familiar? No, smoochy boochies. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today on the podcast is William Greenway. He goes by Bill, unless you're typing his name in on Amazon to get one of the books, because they're excellent. We're going to be talking possibly about two different books. One is A Reasonable Belief, Why God and Faith Make Sense, and then The Challenge of Evil, Grace and the Problem of Suffering. They're both they're really odd for theology books. They're not painfully long. They're easy to read while introducing you to a host of different thinkers and concepts. So I don't know what happened in Bill's life that he decided to make theology too accessible, but something did. And he's out in Austin at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And that's also where Cindy Rigsby is, who's been on the podcast a number of times. So it's great to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Tripp. And I've listened to numerous of your podcasts now, and I really have enjoyed them.
Well, that's what I like to hear. Some people come on, they don't listen to the podcast, and then they take it way too seriously. So you have permission to end up leading us wherever you want to go. And the magical world of podcasting, all the stuff that we don't want will get edited out, and it's going to look like we're twice as brilliant and 10 times as handsome as we really are. So maybe the place to begin on these two books that are connected and really dealing with the question of God. But how was it that you got interested as a person of faith, as a philosopher, in the question of God?
Well, in terms of the question of God, I was raised Christian, and then I studied philosophy and sociology and all these other sort of subjects that I think, like a lot of people, they go to college and suddenly the questions are outstripping their ability to answer them. And these books are an attempt. I think there's something about crisis of foundations in theology and ethics and in faith. And I actually think there's a reasonable way to affirm faith. It's not the normal way of providing arguments for the existence of God. But like I say in the book, I think that we can see faith as a wholly reasonable orientation within the world when we open ourselves to the way in which we are so often seized by the faces of others, and really that becomes in many ways the Archimedean point. That's the basis of from which everything else flows out, is that lived event of having been seized by love for the faces of others. And I think that confronts us on a daily basis. And so in that sense, insofar as that's, as I will unfold in the books, to be seized by love, God is that immediate presence, and there is no distance there, and there's no real question there for so many of us if we can kind of frame it in the right way. So, and I think it's I think it's a very powerful spirituality that people feel whether they say they're people of faith or not. But I think that the kind of systemic framing of reality in such a way that the reality of agape is disallowed in reasonable discourse and disallowed in public discourse in clear ways, that can occlude its influence. So it's really can be harmful to us and to our awareness to faith.
So maybe a place to begin is describing your understanding of our contemporary secular condition, because one of the things that you do rather well is kind of point out how our experience actually points us towards something more than just the appearances before us and this kind of flattened over rationalistic account of the world, and yet all those assumptions, everyone these days has internalized them, that, regardless of your stance on, you can imagine believing in God or not believing in God, but everybody kind of shares this secular condition that you describe.
Right. And that's why in the book, I spend the first half of A Reasonable Belief tracing kind of modern rationality and drawing a contrast with medieval rationality, so that people have a sense of a whole other way of seeing reality, and recognize that what to us seems like just obvious and given is actually a highly constructed way of viewing reality. And so it's not as obvious as it seems. And what I try to trace is, I say there was a major conceptual revolution that kind of generated the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And this can be most easily related to Descartes' two spheres, where he says, you have a sphere of nature and you have a sphere of spirit. And the sphere of nature is what we think of as everything in the human and social sciences, and nature is some sort of a flux or continuum of strings or whatever you're going to do it, but it's a causal indeterminate, slash thing. And then you have over here mind, and that's what humans are with free will and creative capacities. And the big conceptual revolution is from the Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology of the medieval period, which really no one knows about, to Descartes. So we know the far side of that. We don't see it as a contrast effect. And then I argue about a quiet revolution that I think has taken place in the centuries since Descartes, in which, recently, to be a Cartesian dualist is to be instantly mocked in most university settings. So the quiet revolution is the eliding of that sphere of mind. And so you have prominent, especially in Western English-speaking philosophy, the naturalistic or materialistic or metaphysical naturalistic or physicalist. There's a lot of names for it, but the idea that the sphere of nature is everything, and somehow even mind is a product of that. And then I work closely with, following Manuel Levinas, who is really one of my inspirational figures, but with him following Martin Heidegger's work in Being and Time, where Heidegger in his analysis of time and being and understanding itself opens back up a place for that sphere of mind. He uses different terms that I won't, technical terms I won't use here, but he opens up a space, and you see suddenly that this space is has to reasonably be posited if you're going to talk about science as such. So that he brings back a space for eyes, freely self-creating, poetic, I call eyes. And that's a capital I I'm talking about there. And so that opens up. And so you end up with both then, he doesn't deny the realm of nature and the legitimacy of the sciences, but he affirms that, but he has this other realm of these freely self-creating eyes. And the problem is that if the people who are naturalistic, who only will talk and think reality is exhausted by that sphere of nature realm, have no space for the divine, and no space for moral reality. Even though if you add that sphere of poetic eyes, all you've got then is desires I might have, love that I might have in the sense that I like things, or these are things I like. You can't get to beyond that to some moral reality. And so, in fact, to some degree, insofar as the ideal for those poetic eyes, and someone can think here of Sartre or someone like that, or the ideals of authenticity, Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence among poets, all these folks, the thing to do is to really be an I, is to transcend the flux in my conditioning, biological or psychological and family, and become my own freely self-created I. And from that position, really, the idea of a God or moral reality which would pose demands upon me can be seen as a threat. And so, but this is not consciously thought by a lot, but those two spheres of Descartes, and Kant has his version, and you have different, Heidegger has his, but they're essentially the same spheres. Those are the kind of what most all of us think in terms of. And so this is, I think, at the root of the crisis in ethics, which is related to something, I don't know how technical to be here, to Sidgwick's dualism of practical reason, where you take utilitarian theory. Utilitarians did a great job of connecting good and evil to the material world by indexing good and evil to pain and pleasure, or my preferences and what I don't want. And so that worked great, and it seems to give some place for good and evil. But what they could never explain is why I would, want the greatest good for the greatest number. That doesn't seem to have any anchoring anywhere. So that problem is there. So you have, on the one hand, an inability of either those who are naturalistic or those who are naturalistic and existentialist or affirm the self-creating I to articulate clearly the moral reality, which I find seizes most of them. I mean, most of these people were really good people. So it's not a matter of people who are moral versus those who are not, so much as it is people who are caught within ways of understanding which impede their ability to name and affirm the reality by which they've been seized, and those who can name it. And what I suggest, wanting fully to affirm the sphere of nature in the modern sciences and fully to affirm our creativity in the sphere of existential eyes, is also to say, in our encounter with reality, we also find ourselves seized daily by the faces of others, and here again is where I'm very dependent upon Levinas, and Levinas's, I think, experiences as a Jewish prisoner in a Nazi labor camp, and he comes out of that experience where he has been seized by other faces, and in that experience, the conviction he's come to is there is nothing more sure, nothing more objectively that I can be confident in than the reality that this is wrong. And the complex metaphysical deductions that lead to these two spheres are not more certain than my immediate having been seized by these faces with so much power That in times when I don't desire it, I'd love to look away from what I'm seeing, but I find myself taken hostage by them. And that's where ethics, that's where Levinas says ethics becomes first philosophy, displacing epistemology. And he uses hostage language. I prefer language of having been seized. And what I think that describes is in that moment of encounter that remains a little bit hidden in Heidegger, but it's just as real. And I want to name it. What one is seized by is not he talks about the face of the other, but it's I'm seized by love for the face of the other. And this is just the perfect description of what Christians and many others have meant by agape, a love which is not from me, not a product of me, not a function of my choice, my creation, my conditioning, but a love which has me for every face. And that's kind of the anchor point for me. And we experience that, and then these rationalities keep us from owning it as real. And so that's why I do all that hard work. And I think it's harder to read in some ways in that first book to allow us to own those experiences, without having doubts in the back of our mind. This isn't really real. This doesn't really fit with the ultimate picture of reality. That notion that what's really real hasn't ever a place for that is itself a construction of the last 300 to 400 years of modern Western thought. And there's been much productive out of that. There's no going, I want to celebrate the sciences, but to see the sphere of explanation and reality as science describes it as not just accurate, but exhaustive, becomes problematic. I want to see it as accurate, but not able to fully describe these other sorts of encounters that permeate our existence.
So when you start to describe the three different spheres, and I'm interested in if you see connections there between kind of the activity of knowing, the activity of doing, and that third one that you're describing as agape. Are there connections there to kind of like Schleiermacher and that feeling of absolute dependence?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, so but what I think is actually that so Schleiermacher is Schleiermacher. I teach Schleiermacher. He's wonderful, but I actually think feeling of absolute dependence doesn't come close to capturing the reality that he is so clearly trying to convey. And so when you think of him trying philosophically to express, I think, the experiences he had, as essentially an orphan coming up in the Moravian Brotherhood, and at the end of his life, he says he ends up being a Herrenhutter, a reference to where we had those profound experiences of a higher order. So that those experiences of what I would describe as koinonia, and then later, like in his dialogue on the incarnation, when he goes through all these sort of theories of incarnation, but at the end you have, I think it's Joseph come in. And what he says is that, we would have been better off if we just sung Christmas songs together and played with the children and had that joy, right? So I think that, what I'm saying is that that reality, that Schleiermacher is gesturing towards with feeling of absolute dependence, actually I think is better captured with this language of having been seized in and by love by every face. And for me, the koinonia happens when you're seized in and by love for a face, which is simultaneously seized in and by love for you. And that's where your love is made complete. And so it's not just between you and me, it's you and me taking up and having been seized by agape, which insofar as God is agape, this is having been seized by God, one for the other in community. And so, there might be other differences in Levinas that we have to negotiate, but I actually think that the spiritual reality, which seems to me to empower his work, is expressed very well in the moves I'm making.
When in the Challenge of Evil book, you talk about the problem of negativity of meaning, and that what is often described as just meaninglessness is better understood as a negativity of meaning. And like before getting there, like one of the ideas that came up in my mind when you're thinking of the different spheres is how each one would explain things that were most defining of us. Say like your relationship with your partner. In one sense, the the nature explanation probably has something to do with the desire for your genes to reproduce, and that we select based on all sorts of things. And you can give a biological account, DNA account, social biological account, and then in the other side, and having been a minister for a long time until I just started teaching full time like 2 years ago. But before that, I'd been a minister 16 years. And the number of times I've heard people frame the problems going on in their marriage in the sphere of eyes is one of the places I see the problem of negativity, where the assumption they come in when talking about their relationship is that they are these two distinct eyes that have some essence. It has to be authentically recognized by the other. The relationship has to be one where you can express it. And even in ones that the relationships end or stay together, the way they frame the problem is on these closed eyes that are looking and seeking for recognition. And that if we just are, understood fully by the other, recognized by the other, the problems go away. And I think, I always was frustrated with this. And I tried to come up with as many different ways to get people to sidestep, for that framing. And it wasn't until I was reading your book that I go, oh, it's but take a step back into agape, or what becomes possible in that covenantal encounter if you're thinking of marriage or whatever. That I remember sitting with a couple going, well, here's your job. The next 2 weeks, you have to go on 4 dates, and you're not allowed to talk about anything serious. And at the end of it, we'll come back to my office and you're going to tell me what is really, really wrong. And I did it a couple times. I've never had someone come back in if they, took going on the dates and not arguing and come back and go, why'd you have me do that? They come back and go, oh, I really get why I'm here. Yeah. And we can figure this out and we're going to work it out, because the reason you're there is not located in these spheres where then the relationship is framed in negativity, because your friends and everyone else is framing it in this kind of I sphere, that the relationship it needs to be meeting both of our needs, and these needs are determined, autonomously and internally. So, anyway, sorry, that was an excursus, but
it's okay.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating and interesting and complicated. So I have multiple responses. One is that, marriage, friendship, children, is not quite the same as the morals, right? So
right.
It brings all three spheres into play. And so, the third sphere of agape, and I'm following Levinas here, with the face. The face it has no color of hair, no skin, no ethnicity, no uniform. Even it's the face is manifest precisely and wholly in one's having been seized by love for it. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, sometimes people mishear me, because it's funny how our thinking tends to be reductionistic and imperialistic. So they tend to think that I want to, do this third sphere to the neglect of the other two. And just like, sometimes you get existentialists and they sound like they're against science, and you get scientists who sound like they're against these others, where I want to celebrate all three spheres and affirm them. Mm-hmm. And so that means the sphere of nature would be the sphere of me insofar as I am bodily. And it would include erotic desires, mm-hmm. and those would be good, right? And they can be bad, but they're bad when they violate the sphere of agape. So when I don't, but when you put, so agape, first of all, has to be pure in terms of the moral. So it's not preferential. It's not mm-hmm. because I like you more, or you might do more for me. At that point, it becomes corrupted. However, when we talk about a spouse, well, then what you want is not just agape, which is towards every other face, but agape plus eros, plus probably a creative synergy that comes together. Mm-hmm. So you have the erotic sphere, you have the aesthetic sphere, and then you have the agapic sphere. And in a really, in what I would say is the best relationship, all three of those spheres are functioning. Now, there can be things that go wrong in each of the spheres, right? And so to some degree, problems in a marriage can have to do with things that really are psychological or even psychiatric or other sorts of problems like that. And there I would want simply to defer to people who have training and expertise in those spheres and say that what I'm doing isn't going to really help. I don't have that, and I want to affirm that other. And sometimes it's the aesthetic. I mean, they just get bored, and the marriage is not a living way of being poetic. I mean, I want to affirm the poetry and creativity. There's plenty of space for creativity without violating the faces of others. In this sense, it's never art just for the sake of art justifies anything. There are boundaries, so you don't get to claim your art to justify you're abusing someone else, right? And there's borderlines where there'll be debates. But what I saw you doing in that thing where you said you're just sort of going to play together. So the thing about the sphere of agape is that you can't. It's not intentional. This is what trips people up, because insofar as I'm not simply a product in modern Western thought, I'm an I. I'm an intentional I. That's where Descartes' I think, therefore I am has a spirituality embedded in it, where everything comes from the I out. And so that phrase is essentially contrary to faith, even though I want to affirm many things it does. And so you can't just decide you're going to love someone else in the sense of having been seized by love. The grammar says it. You can, an example I use a lot, you can't decide, well, I should love the homeless. But what you can decide is I'm going to work with the homeless. I'm going to work with this other group. And in that process of working with folks, getting to know them, you can become awakened to their faces. And so you become open to having been seized by them. For people who are severely wounded, sometimes that face needs just to be a plant that they're going to care for, or maybe a dog, something which is non-threatening, and that can awaken them to this love. So leaving space for lots of psychological and pastoral care and counseling explanations for why what you did worked, and not wanting to, but at the same time, I'd say what you kind of did was ask them to go to a place where these other things would fade and they could be awakened once more to each other's faces. And that dimension of having been seized by love for the other could be added. Now, I say that's how I could address what you said and why it worked with my thing. But I don't want anyone to forget. The first thing I also said was there might be other psychological explanations for the other two spheres. And so I want to this is where it's really important that what I'm saying is that each of these kind of families of vocabularies which inscribe rationalities and which take ultimate reality under certain forms of description. This is where I'm different from Descartes. There's no ontological dualism or triism here. It's not a trinity, but I'm saying that we, at this point, whatever the character of ultimate reality is, we have the fullest way of articulating and understanding in terms of these three spheres. But I want to affirm all three and have a place for each.
So, one of the problems I think that you emphasize is that tendency coming out of the Enlightenment for any of the three spheres to kind of say, give an explanatory account that's like, that says this is just, and then they insert that sphere's account that it's reductive, right? And if you live in Southern California long enough, the agape sphere has just as many versions of that where they will explain it, give nice spiritual examples of everything. And I wonder if there's a sense that where would you locate that desire to really explain everything away? Like, when was it that human beings really wanted final, certain, conclusive, hold on an answer to the question why? That's like the worst question to try to figure out a final answer to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you read the pre-Socratics and others, and it looks like it goes back pretty far. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I don't think it's a near-term sort of an issue. I do think in modernity, with kind of the move to epistemology as first philosophy, Descartes' demand that what counts as knowledge is only that which is logically indubitable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I follow C.S. Peirce and when you say, that is an impossible standard. We need to go about that which we have no living or real doubt. And then we can sort things from more centered to more peripheral quite reasonably, which is just what we do in science and these other areas. I just think that names, that desire gets amplified, in modern thought, but like you are suggesting, I think it's always been there. And I think I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, that's not a question I've really thought about, but I want to be generous always in my responses. I think, it comes from, in one sense, the desire to kind of have things comes from a sense of fear, fear of the unknown, of the uncertainty of existence. And I think that fear then tends to focus energy on oneself. And so all the threats become massive. And if you can pretend that you can capture that, seize that with knowledge, it gives you a certain escape. I think actually Richard Rorty describes this dynamic in that respect well, how the philosophical desire to transcend the contingencies of existence and pretend that they have a grasp on this other gives some sort of a comfort, a cold comfort maybe, but a comfort. The problem is it locks us into ourselves. And so the rhetoric cuts us off from the what in my mind is a saving love of the having been seized. And fear does that. And so you want to understand the fear, but that's why, and fear is real. I mean, it's a legitimate fear. The one place I depart from Levinas is that and this is what my making vivid and adding to the formula that agape does, is the agape that seizes me for the other, has seized me just as much, my face just as much as the other is manifest in that dynamic. So there is, a place to affirm fear, a place to mourn folks who are suffering and maybe perishing. And that's real. And there's no, as I say in The Challenge of Evil, I'm not giving a solution to the reality of evil. I'm giving a way of one, naming it and taking it seriously, and another, second, a way of seeing how it does not overcome the reality of the having been seized, but actually explains it in a sense. Because to be, and this is where this lets me give a definition of evil. And here again, I think I'm closely following Levinas, so I depart from him in many ways. That when I see something and I see it as a horror, as evil, what I'm seeing is the violation of the face. So inscribed within evil, the experience of evil as such, is this prior sense of having been seized by the face such that this should not be. Because when you're seized by the face, what you want is for that face to flourish according to its kind. And so the other thing that I see that's closely related to this is the kind of the comfort that comes in the denial of that sphere. And this is where I go into the rejection of God in the face of having witnessed an overwhelming horror. That now that I've seen this, I just can't affirm God. But to say, if you really took that seriously and you got rid of whatever one might mean by God there, you're still facing all the same horror in the world. And now it's the world you're a part of. And so now you still have the concrete evil and you still have all of the ferocious condemning energy, which I actually think is a morally good energy. But the idea that rejecting God solves anything is kind of, God acts kind of as a black hole absorbing all of that. But that's a bit of a self-deception at that point. And Nietzsche, the self-overcoming, which denies moral reality, it functions in another way. So in an odd way, the affirmation just of the sphere of nature protects us a bit from this sort of a condemnation. And that's the other thing where what you say is negativity. The people who affirm that the world is meaningless except for what we make of it, kind of escape the challenge of evil that way, the spiritual challenge.
Well, yeah, I think I want to let's unpack that a bit first, just to let people that are listening know the difference between face with a lowercase f and the face capital F, because if they aren't familiar with Levinas, that sense in which the face with a capital F is an awakening to that dimension.
Right.
You're being seized by and in love for face with a capital F, this this part of reality that is as real as anything else. It's just not part of our appearances.
Yeah. And I should say that the way I do the capital and small f is my reading of Levinas. There are multiple ways of reading Levinas that would do that differently. He uses capitalization differently too. So just to be clear on that, let me put it in context, because I think a lot of your listeners will be familiar with this kind of the general discourse about the other, which often is a moral discourse, but what the other is a socio-political or an ethnic or a racial or something other like that. And you describe that other, and the point in the predominant discourse in a lot of the academy is then you care for that other and you respect that, you acknowledge the differences and all of that. But what's missing in all that is why you care. And so you can just as easily identify the others so that you can keep them other, and react differently to them.
I think current political
that's
demonstrated
more and more
possible.
obvious. But what's then and a theologian named Myra Vera does a really nice job on this, I think, in looking at the work of Spivak, saying that there's this ghostly presence that manifests in Spivak, which explains why that's not what's going on. And that's not what any of those people do, but it remains inarticulated. And so what's missing, where Rivera sees this kind of magical or ghostly thing in Spivak is exactly where I'm saying it's agape. And that's implicit in Levinas. Levinas never says it. In this way, he's really quite faithful in keeping God absolutely hidden where God is most fully manifest, right? And so I'm much more Christian in wanting to name this, and I think I get some other things from it too. But the face then, small f, is who you are in relationship to me, and your identity that's indexed to ethnicity or race or even the uniform, or whether you're my superior. If you do the parable of the Good Samaritan and later it turns out the guy in the ditch was the son of my boss, it changes the parable. It's essential to the parable that person is not identified. So the face, this is how you keep the face from being, with a capital F, a sphere of nature or a sphere of poetic eyes reality. And so what the face is then, and I said this before, but it's not clear, is it's precisely that which seizes you in the other, and nothing other than that. And so this is why I tell stories in the books, all my books. I tell lots and lots of stories in which I make faces manifest, stories of plants, stories of animals, stories of people. And of course, Levinas is, the stories in the camps, because the stories aren't just decorations. The stories are the only way in which I can make the faces manifest. Mm-hmm. If I'm only trying to describe a logic, or say, this or that reason or ethic or principle or theology or scripture says so, then I haven't escaped the realm of history, of reasons. I will be in the small f realm. But this is what really makes this difficult for folks. The face in that sense is immediately, it seizes us, right? You can choose to harden your heart to it, but you don't choose it. It has you. And in that sense, it's as real a force in the world as gravity. Mm-hmm. But it is not any of the small f faces. It's not, and for Levinas, take Levinas. This for Levinas meant even, when he says it doesn't matter what uniform you're wearing, even that he knows he's seized also by the faces of his captors. Now he's not a pacifist. He fought the Nazis. He didn't advocate that. But at the same time, that's at the level of the small f face. Mm-hmm. But this capital F face still has you, which I think gives us a good way of understanding what it is to love your enemies.
Yeah.
It's to be seized by the faces, capital F, of your enemies, even as within the world is they're doing wrong. You might be forced to fight them for the sake of other faces. So that's kind of the complexity of the concept. And I also do it in terms of a distinction between the moral and the ethical. I'll just gesture to that here. I'm not sure if I answered your question sufficiently.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, I think one of the things that that helps is that, for Levinas, if it was just insofar as like the appearances are concerned, then he's a nihilist in the sense that like if the appearances are all that's there, then yeah, like nihilism makes sense. It's just that the appearances are deceptive, and the place in which he points to this reality is that experience of being seized, that kind of like that opening where the material existence that comes before us becomes symbolic in a sense of something much deeper, where, we're recording this. Y'all can hear our voices. We can see each other's faces. But the human body is the world's most powerful symbol. Like we see each other. I read your book. You've listened to the podcast before. Now we see each other in our bodies, and all the noises and stuff we make are a symbol for like an actual living subjectivity, that's there. And then, we're hoping to relate to it. We're hoping that our body and the way we use our body and stuff reflects what's there. But there's this like depth of mystery of the subject before you that when we don't acknowledge it as human beings, we end up doing violence to each other. And I think
ourselves.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so can you kind of unpack then, like, if appearances are deceptive, which shouldn't be shocking for a religious person to say. Let's just like, that's all through the scriptures. But, what then, what's the problem, the spiritual challenge that, meaningless, like of meaning, like when nihilism, that position denies God, Levinas in a sense is also, you used to say, is also denying like part of reality.
Yeah. And here I'm appropriating Levinas, and I think this is consistent with him, but again, I'm a little different. But, so in what you said, we can hear some of the problems, like where you talked about mystery or even symbol, and the use of the word experience. And so, I'm usually trying to be very careful in my books to talk about encounter. Mm-hmm. Or simply the having been seized, because so clearly everything between us is mediated. This is where the significance of the work I do on the gift and Jean-Luc Marion comes in, right? So you need the visible sphere, but the idea that the visible sphere in the sense of experience and material in that sphere of nature sense exhausts the character of reality. That's what's not obvious or given. That is a very highly abstract conclusion, and it runs counter to the ways in which, through the physical. So obviously, I'm using words. We're communicating in these ways, but the what might be communicated through that, and the nature of the encounter then we have. Is not necessarily, and I would say clearly is not reduced to what can be captured in the categories of the material. Mm-hmm. So the material is clearly a part of it. With Levinas, and again, so I want to acknowledge my debts to Levinas, but I don't want to pretend that I'm not combining things in a way that may not be exactly what he does. But I use his distinction between the said and the saying. And so the said is the material words that come between us, written or spoken, or maybe even just a hug that I give you, or some sort of a wave of something like that. Well, so this is a wave. You can interpret this, completely, and it will have meaning within the sphere of the sciences. And in terms of what I do, kinship, group, reciprocal altruism, all true. The question is whether they're exhaustive of what's going on. And so what he would say is I can said, I love you. Or I can say, I love you. In either case, the said is what does it, the words, I love you. But in some instances, you realize those words are not expressing something that's coming from me, and not just a matter of meaning, which negotiates then, who we are in relationship to each other, but are expressing another reality, which has me for you. Mm-hmm. And again, this is where the sense in which the giver, doesn't give the gift, doesn't originate the gift, but surrenders to the love they have for the other. And when the other surrenders to that same love, then that's the manifest reality. And it's a manifest reality in our encounter with each other in reality. So this is where all the work I've done in the spheres is significant, because as I say that, the power of these deep background Western understandings, modern Western philosophical understandings are so deep, it's tempting even for people who know exactly what I'm talking about to have in the back of my mind, but that's not really real.
Yeah.
We know what's really real is this flux. And everything you're doing must not be really real. And that's why it's so important to say, no, those descriptions are accurate, but they're not exhaustive of the character of reality. And they're not exhaustive of the most significant character of reality. I use an example often with Levinas on proximity, where I talk about proximity in the sphere of nature is whether you and I are close to each other. And so, I could be sitting next to somebody and we're in close proximity. But proximity with a capital P, which is the sphere of agape proximity, which goes with the capital F, sphere of agape face, that's a different sort of proximity. That's the proximity I experience when someone calls me from halfway around the world. And whether it's joy or horror or fear or, anxiety, they speak to me and suddenly they have me and I am seized by their face. And we are in absolute proximity, even though we're halfway around the world. On the other hand, you can sit next to someone in a church pew and be half a world away.
Yeah.
And what I want to say is that other proximity, we know that proximity. We know that having been seized by the face of the other. We know that reality, but we are alienated by the vocabularies and rationalities within which we've been inscribed from taking those seriously. And the problem is then when we go to talk about that reality, we tend to use the vocabularies and languages of the other two spheres. Mm-hmm. And so then we can't articulate it adequately. Or someone can say, well, you used the word experience, didn't you? You know what an experience is, and they get you to the five senses and then you're done. And that's why Levinas invents a lot of new language, because he's so sensitive. And me too. That's why I'm using all this new language, because I don't want to be pulled back down in. But that, and you talk about all the agape in Southern California, and so to some degree, I would want to affirm that. But there's also not a relativism here. There's a respect for the ability to be subject oneself to prejudices and to systemic distortions. And so there's built into what I'm also doing is a kind of working from Hans-Georg Gadamer's notions of the classical, while being aware of Habermas and others' critical, hermeneutics of suspicion, kind of putting those into a thing. There's a place here for affirming, like I said, what's most central. So what are the notions of agape, which have the widest intercultural breadth and the deepest historical depth, which means then that, scriptures of all the world's traditions, but certainly our own, have authority. They're not inerrant or infallible maybe, but they are not there. They haven't gotten the status by accident, nor the great theologians, spiritual folks, and mystics who we celebrate. Anyway, I kind of bled into several different things there.
Well, one of the things in the book on evil is you develop it as a type of philosophical spirituality. It's not a book that's located in one religious tradition. And actually, early in the book, the way you even set up dealing with the problem of evil is unique in that often the problem of evil is set up for a theodicy where, a theologian of some particular tradition addresses the particularity of their God, remaining good and benevolent in the face of evil. Right. And what you do early in the book is kind of go, but the problem of evil is an even bigger deal. In the context of a kind of materialist account of the world. Like, what is it that is being denied and supplanted when you can't acknowledge the reality of evil? And that's that where you pick up the question of nihilism, and maybe you could say a bit about how nihilism is, or maybe describe the nihilism that kind of comes out of someone like Nietzsche and how it facilitates a type of salvation that involves a rejection of the moral reality that the acknowledgement of the face kind of demands of us.
Right. And so I'm really trying to answer a question that I think Charles Taylor posed in his book Sources of the Self. Mm-hmm. And
a great book.
To point out that one, nihilism kind of follows from modern Western picture of the character of the world. And like many of the people I cite early in the book, people who have faced up to this reality that there's no cosmic purpose, there's no good and evil. We are ourselves, each of us, the expression of the highest possibility. And so, face up to that and take joy in knowing it and create yourself as robustly as possible. And that those things are typically framed, or often framed by many of the folks without attending much to evil. It just kind of is off the page. And Taylor says this is one of the things that distinguishes Nietzsche, is that he was genius enough, and also as the son and grandson of Lutheran pastors and a one-time divinity student, he was seized enough, by the faces that he realized that he saw evil as an existential challenge to his own. So he needed, after there's no God, how do you affirm yourself in reality? So Nietzsche, saw past what I talked about earlier as this denial. Mm-hmm. And what Taylor says is that that's why he says Nietzsche talks about a self-overcoming of our moral kind of sensitivities, and he sees in that then a spiritual mutilation. Because you're forced to overcome, in my language, you're left struggling to overcome the way you've been seized by the faces of others. And if Nietzsche's wrong about the character of reality, not only is that going to be, impossible because this is an actual reality, mm-hmm. but you're going to be, you left your life striving, for a nihilism over and against this. But Nietzsche didn't see a way out. And so that answers the first part of your question. And the book really is in some ways an attempt to answer that dilemma, although I end up framing it slightly differently than Taylor. It's still largely related to him. But then it goes where it goes. So I don't want to. I delineate three kind of classic challenges of evil, and one is the one you referenced, which is the good God, omniscient God, an omnipotent God, and evil. How do you put these three together? And that is a legitimate question, right? Why in the world do we have this evil if there's this sort of God? I don't know the answer to that question. So far, no one knows the answer to that question. But I don't, insofar as I'm not constructing an argument for God, that is not in any way a stopper, for an affirmation. It's okay to say, I don't know. If there is, somehow someday a God and there's some life after, maybe I'll know then. Well, but I don't know now.
Well, I think it's a good idea to point out that a theologian teaching minister said you have permission to say, I don't know. Just how many ministers and how many people of faith, have just the needing to know creates more problems than necessary. So we all have permission to not know. We all have permission to change our mind. And if life is busy and stressful and you need to attend more to the people around you, than to stay up all night worrying about something, you have permission to say, I'll get to that later. And
even to lament. I think that's where the Psalms of lament, even to be angry, but the Psalms are addressed to the God you still hope to hope in. But there's an honesty about how we react in these situations, which I think, it needs to be affirmed with all of that too. Yes. So there's that logical problem of evil. And again, that's a real problem, but it's tended to be the dominant problem in the modern West, largely in academic contexts. And I don't think it's an accident that theodicy arises as such in the modern period, when we begin to think we have to construct arguments for the existence of God, and then evil becomes an obstacle to carrying that argument through. And so again, while I think it's a real issue, so I don't want to, and I think the work that's been done on it has been productive. For me, in no way is it a stopper from a reasonable affirmation of agape, the reality of a God of agape. And then in addition to that, and I like to make sure I say this one too, there's also the challenge of concrete real evils. Because it's easy to do a whole class in theodicy and actually only use actual real evils as illustrations, without, thinking, it's really important for me to, apart from the, figuring out this theoretical problem, figuring out how to actually address real evils. And so that's the second sort of challenge of evil. But the third is the one I'm really focused on, which I call the spiritual challenge of evil, and which I think in modernity has maybe been most, powerfully articulated through Ivan Karamazov in the Brothers Karamazov. But it's, you hear it all the time in the church as well. Someone who has had an experience, often not about themselves, but often about someone close to them or even a stranger, where they've had a close experience of someone who's endured such horrific suffering, such unjust suffering, that in the face of that, they say, I just can't believe in God now. This is just, they're overwhelmed by that. And the book is about answering that challenge of evil, which I think in many ways is the most significant of them. I'm not sure many people are alienated from faith and because they have a problem with the logical problem of evil. I think it's more they just find themselves unable, given the reality of the evil experience, to affirm God. And that's where what I call and especially in another book, For the Love of All Creatures, the decisive asymmetry is so significant, to realize that the one, if you reject God wholly, so you're no longer objecting, the real stakes of that problem of evil, the spiritual problem of evil, become manifest, because now you realize that what's at stake is your ability to affirm existence, and insofar as you're a part of that existence, your ability to affirm yourself. And so how do you do that? And I mean, I just don't know how to say this in just a few words, but at the root of it is a sense that in my horror that's motivating this entire reaction, my horror over the violation of the face of the other is precisely a product of my having been seized by agape for them. Yeah. And so why I don't have a solution. I can't say everything is going to work out well. Injustice is real. I mean, these are the most obvious things in the world, really, that the world is in this sense fallen, not as a historical thing, but as again, when you look at the sphere of nature in poetic eyes from the sphere of agape, what you see is all sorts of suffering, injustice, and horror. And that's, where the sense of fall for me gets traction. Is maybe one of the most obvious realities of all. But to realize that precisely in that, you're seized by that agape. And to affirm that. And also, again, it takes me a long time to unfold this, to realize that in that sense, that agape is not defeated by the evil, but in fact is what is making you see it as evil. That's what can lead to some hope anyway. And that agape is the final word. Yeah. And that somehow, and that's where I actually dare, working on philosophical premises, to suggest that it's reasonable to hope for literal life after death. It's not something that we do in a selfish way, but philosophically that's quite a move to make. But that's the character of the hope that can be given to me as I release myself to having been seized by agape. And this also then anchors notions of forgiveness, because let me go back to you and let you direct the conversation.
Well, tell me if you think this. I would remember when I was reading the book, I liked it a lot, and it leads to bringing it up when you're with your other nerdy friends, and one of the ways I kind of, while drinking and talking to someone, said back the book, I said,
I love that image of how the book's being read. That sounds perfect to me, by the way.
Sometimes if I like something, I have a real good gift at reading into every little space, everything I wish it said or I thought it should have said, because I want to affirm it. And so, I said, What Greenway's doing is pointing out that this materialist quest for meaning is framed as this, well, let's accept our finitude, right? Like, we don't have to believe in this God anymore. We're freed from it. Just realize you're on a planet. The sun's going to swallow it soon. But you won't be around here to know about it. And it doesn't matter because whoever's here, we'll probably have killed each other already at that point. And so life becomes this quest to learn to fully affirm, to have parties and accepting our finitude. But the actual meaning of our day-to-day life is generated from our resistance to the meaninglessness that exists in appearances, in the way things really are.
And that's just, I'm sorry.
And so the problem of evil, I thought was so powerful, is it's like someone could hear that and be like, that's right. I'm finally, my parents told me I couldn't doubt at church. I realized, that Moses didn't write the 5 books of Moses. Evil sucks. God's a jerk, gonna throw people into hell. What, probably throws Gandhi into hell. This is bullshit. Now I'm just gonna try to seize my life. It's my one life. I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do. And then your response to is like, yeah, but then what do you do with the fact, of evil? Like, the problem of evil gets received completely differently when you don't even have a failed God of pseudo love and justice to point to. And I really ruined the evening when I brought it up. Because I said, I think I'd rather be a Calvinist at that point.
Well, and that's where, you see, I see those people as, tragically lost, right? Because, the way you framed it was perfect. It's a question of finitude. It's a question of meaning, and there's a complete meaninglessness. So at least I can make the most of it. And that whole way of framing things, which is kind of a very predominant modern Western way of framing the issue, evil just is off the page. Simultaneously, most of those people are some of those most, they're not all nihilists in their lived lives. They are some of the most morally sensitive people in the world. And so this is where they're alienated by their own vocabularies. So what I'm saying is, and that's why in the first half of the Challenge of Evil, I go through both the rejecting God out of anger, which I see as a highly moral response and a tragic response that I want to have sympathy for. But it's in the end, it's hopeless, because you're using God there to shelter you in a way from the real challenge of evil that appears once you get rid of the whole idea of God entirely. And then I do Nietzsche, and then I do deep ecology and some of these other Western trajectories, and point out how they all end up marginalizing that challenge. And so maybe a quick way to say it is we don't really have a problem of meaning. The problem we have is too much meaningfulness. The problem is the character of what most all of these folks, right? So there are such things as sociopaths, we know. So there's, but they're not a counter argument. But all these folks who are simultaneously moral, right? We have more meaningfulness than we can handle. The problem is the character of the meaningfulness, all of the horror and the suffering by which we're seized. And it's no wonder we want to deny it and close our eyes to it. I mean, Levinas understood that. He said, we don't want to be seized that way. And we don't. So it's, in that sense, you can see Nietzsche, as I suggest, he's not just wrong about reality. He's actually creating an escape from this challenge. And that's where Taylor does a good job of saying that you escape this huge cost in your own spiritual being. And if I'm right, and it's not the character of reality, it's an impossible move. But it's you can understand the motivation. What's paradoxical about the motivation is the motivation is grounded in those people having been seized by agape for the faces of others. Mm-hmm. And so the reality of the moral, and which is the reality of agape, which insofar as God is love. And I'm a Christian. I do this as a Christian, but I don't think this divine reality is exclusive, right, to Christianity, or has been. But I'm using that vocabulary. But insofar as that's God, then there's an implicit affirmation of the reality of God in that. But when you frame it as a question of meaning, or a question of meaningfulness, that, I think, right in that framing, you have done in a very surreptitious way, even from oneself, not deliberate, written evil off the page. where simultaneously that's in the spiritual sense, how we can affirm the world and stuff. It is right on us, as an encounter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sense in which, only sphering the sphere of nature is a protective strategy. I mean, it's not done that way deliberately, but it can function that way by saying, this evil isn't really real. It's and the same with just these two spheres. But again, the vast majority of people who even will do that are simultaneously people who are profoundly seized by the faces of others.
Yeah.
And that's where I see them as people lost, tragically lost. Their vocabularies are not adequate to the fullness of their encounter with reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the theological vocabularies and others are, and bring that in.
So I was reading that when Trump decided, that he was going to go bomb something in Syria because he saw the video of a kid. And my very progressive neighbor that was just complaining about it, going like, well, what are you gonna do? Just, you see a picture and now you just decide to blow something up, and then, the hardcore Trumpites on Twitter are very upset because he, didn't do what he said. And, I was in the middle of reading your book and I was like, well, maybe if someone's face becomes the face, then the problem is that everyone else he's making decisions for doesn't have that same part of their existence. Not that this one kid pointed out to him that like his foreign policy was based on all the others not being like human, right? Like they were things to be managed with his instrumental reason, and don't have this inherent dignity that the moment the picture's in front of you, he discovers. And I remember after that that was my thought because I was reading your book. And the next morning in New York Times, one of the op-eds said that they're not surprised because everyone that goes into the room with him, he just becomes this like nice, different person. He knows how to work him, starts talking. And while it might be an exaggerated version, I think that like in the frustration we could have with someone with that much power and what the outcome of the ability to close oneself off from the responsibility you have to all that are connected in this kind of the sphere of agape. I think that in one sense, that's not significantly different than most of us. Like, like most of us know we are connected and in our decisions impact the well-being of others or can harm others and stuff like that. And we regularly come up with ways of protecting ourselves, right, from acknowledging it. So I wonder if, like, how you understand that, what does responsibility look like, or what does spirituality look like when, so much of our natural tendencies and the stories we tell about ourselves are building up resistance to acknowledging, the sphere of agape. Even if you're a person of faith, they're like, I love agape. I read that C.S. Lewis book in college.
Yeah. And I mean, that's where you see the sphere of nature as facilitating something where this is just what's natural. And so, this is, there's a couple of things that come up. The hopeful piece in this is the way in which people on multiple sides of issues can be awakened by faces. And that has certain, that can have certain strategic implications for policy. Because the further you get from the face, the easier it is for that face to become a number, or an entity in some larger equation. Just the small f face, if that. And so concretely, it does explain a way in which size can be a problem. If the person deciding what medical care I'm entitled to is in the room with me, then my face and the moral dimension of that decision will be very real. If the person who ultimately has the responsibility for making that decision is 2,000 miles away, and I'm one of 1,000 decisions they're making on that order of decision a day, then my face is gone. And that that industry will become more and more captured by the utilitarian instrumental reasoning that you referred to. On the other hand, there's nothing I'm saying here about the reality and the profundity of the having been seized by faces, which means that now we have magically an answer to all of our ethical quandaries, or know exactly how to respond when we're seized profoundly by one face. And so it does say, in contrast to what happens in a lot of modern ethics courses, where what we do is we go through one quandary issue after another. We run a series of teleological, deontological, command, these theories at them, none of which are grounded. And because you're looking at quandary issues anyway, at the end of the course, all you've got is kind of a conclusion that everything's relative. Meanwhile, there's a host of ethical issues about which the vast majority of the world's religions and philosophies and we agree. So what we need to do is to say, in terms of what is good, in a way that we can say is objectively as good. It's not a quandary whether people should be tortured in this way. It's not a quandary in terms of the major historical traditions whether beings that have the capacity to read and think should be given the opportunity to read and think. It's not a question about, it's a host of these things. If we had a sense, instead of global relativity, of a global moral consensus, and one might think here in terms to some degree of John Rawls' sphere of overlap, although he remains knee-jerk against religion, then that gives us a way to think about structuring our global treaties and our other responses in an ethical way. Even if we do that, though, we are going to have the quandary issues don't get resolved this way. The quandary issues will endure. That's where you have a conflict between different faces. So you have that face. I mean, who's going to look at the face of that child and say that's good? Or who's going to do that where you're going to take that as a serious counter argument? That's why I say to my students in classes, don't give me an argument unless you really mean it. And so if you really mean that you just don't care at that point, well, then all of us make judgments that are ethical. And at that point, I don't need logical certainty. If it's deep, it's rich, it's wide, it has conviction, then, we do this with all sorts of things where we, with full confidence, keep people from participating in certain activities, because they're so clearly evil. On the other hand, with the quandary issues, then we'll be caught in places where, one, it's not clear what to do. And two, whatever we do, we're going to wound faces. So nothing I'm saying should be taken as making that simple. Now I'm not, so how to respond to that particular instance? The part of Trump that's seized by the face is a part to cultivate. The part which is so taken by one face in a very narrow context that they're not simultaneously awakened to all the other faces. They're not doing all the hard work in the sphere of nature and poetic eyes and politics, sociology, everything else, history. At that point, it's very, at that point, I'm very much with Peter Singer's kind of utilitarian reasoning, except it's grounded differently. Mm-hmm. But at that point, that's where you want a very sophisticated response, but decisively not a response which is in our self-interest, right? So it can't be that this is the response we're going to do simply because we're this country and that's that country. Those responses become ethical insofar as we can say, this is the response we can do. We may be wrong, right? But because this seems to be the response that in the long run, and hopefully in the short run too, is going to be within a world which is inescapably conflicted and we're not, I think the Hebrews are genius in always making the eschatological perfect reality out of the world. It's not something we're going to do. That's going to take some sort of inbreaking thing. So, but nonetheless, we're called in the world to create as loving and peaceful reality as possible, to continually work at that, to be continually aware of whatever we're doing is probably wrong. So you don't baptize any particular structure, but you come up with the political structures and you always have them judged in relationship to the sphere of agape. Just a technical reference. In this sense, there's no state of exception. Mm-hmm. Right? The Agamben and others talk about. Because there's no sovereign who ever steps out of the sphere of agape. So it's not a matter of just sheer decision by some sovereign of any sort. the responsibility of every sovereign of every type is reasonably as well informed by all spheres and as influenced by the spirit of agape to realize, I mean, it's just the Lord's Prayer, that God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, as much as can be the case.
Yeah.
So, without getting into specifics, political specifics, that's kind of how to respond to that set of dilemmas.
Well, what about, or how does this end up framing? I think one of the challenges a lot of Christians are having, where there's this growing awareness and recognition of historic wrongs, be it the privilege of being in the United States, the benefits of imperialism, patriarchy, the historical white privilege in the United States, these type of things. And I think a lot of the anxiety in the church is one kind of the growing awareness of this, and like, do you want to acknowledge it or deny it? And then for those that acknowledge it, that part of your identity is being historically a victim or benefiting from violence. What do you do with that complicity? Do you get like overwhelmed by it? Do you then become seeking some type of ethical purity and things? Towards the end of the book, when you bring up those themes, I found it to be a helpful. You tackle that challenge in a way that you can imagine more cooperation ethically than I think at least the dominant cultural framing of those kind of more historic issues gets put.
Yeah, and so early you asked me this: when did this impulse to be imperialistic and control everything come about? And again, that is a really good and common question, but it's morally empty. Right. And so what I'm suggesting is the deeper issue often is, how do I say yes to myself if I acknowledge my complicity at this depth? And so the reality is the complicity. That's the sense in which the notion of fall, which I think is actually most obvious in the 7 days of creation account, where it stands out as a contrast effect. So you have a picture of the ideal creation. Nothing hurts anything else. Things may die, but they live wonderful lives. Everything's joyful. That's clearly not the world we're in. So the fall is manifest there by contrast effect. By contrast, the Adam and Eve account is far more complex. But fall in that sense, not as a historical event, but the reality. And then original sin is the fact that I find myself already inscribed. Before I've done or thought anything, I am complicit in my very identity in these historic oppressions and in these current oppressions. And so the impulse in all of that to, and again, this is a moral impulse to say, no, I am not guilty. This is where the complexity and the genius of the confession of sin as a regular practice taken seriously. And I think, where Levinas says, I'm more guilty than everyone. And again, as I trace in the Brothers Karamazov's, that core, part of the book, where you have the kind of the Christ figure, taking that up. But in that confession, which is, of the complicity, which as confession is a complete release from me wanting to justify myself, me standing on my own 2 feet, me being able to say yes to myself because I'm innocent. I mean, really, this is what Christianity has always said. It's just honest to say is impossible. And so you release that, but insofar as you release that to having been seized by the faces of others, right? Since that's what motivates the moral, you're releasing that to gracious love. And so what happens is now it's not about me justifying myself. It's, I now don't, this is what it is, I think, to live by faith, to live in the light of grace, to live in the light of having been, this is my definition of faith, right? Living, surrender to having been seized by love for every face, including my own. And that's where in part of the book I have that duality. So, so the denial of the complicity, the pretending that one is innocent, actually that traps one all the more in it because you're still trying to stand on your own feet and really we are complicit. When you can release that, then you are living, and it's not on my own feet, but now I'm not focused on myself. But it's again in that moment of having been seized by the face. That's why in the face to face, the other face is prior. It's not more significant. I depart from Levinas there. I think the idea that the other face is asymmetrically more significant for me is very dangerous in situations of domestic abuse and other situations. Every face, including my own face, is equally seized by agape. But the degree what I live is surrendered to that, then I can acknowledge all of the rest. This is just classic, Luther, simultaneously sinful and redeemed. So what I'm doing here is classic Christian theology. I'm trying to use the other words so that we can see the realities maybe more clearly. But that's the sense in which really to not resist at all, but fully to open up. And then you have concrete problems, right? So that's where the issue is. It's not about purity, right? So my next move is not to simply do whatever I can so I'm as least complicit as possible. In a sense, I am trapped in my complicity. But my main concern is not my complicity, but the faces by which I'm seized. And so now I have to think strategically, right? So, in what patterns of injustice do I remain inscribed? Because in doing that, I can do more for other injustices, right? It's just, and so sometimes it's easy to think that in the face of this, everything I'm doing is so I do as little bad as possible. I think it takes a much more complex calculus. And the reason you can do that calculus is your purity is not the point. What takes you more than anything else is all the faces by which you're inscribed. But then we need all the political science and all the sociology and all the sociobiology and then all of the in my mind, from what churches and synagogues and temples and you and others are doing is we're trying to take this reality of agape and make it manifest in the world so it can have traction. And we need people doing all those things together. And that doesn't mean we're going to now create the eschatological realm. But nonetheless, that's what we're called to in hope, that things will be better than they would have been otherwise at any rate. And that in that way, we're living fidelity to agape.
Yeah.
That's what I see Jesus doing. I mean, that's where this is, talk about not being ashamed of one's face. You see a person who went through life wholly seized by the faces of others, so much so that he spoke truth to power, unrelentingly to the point that it even to the point of death. I mean, that is, in my mind, just a manifestation of this in incredible power.
Mm-hmm. Well, now I'm interested. If you have something you've been thinking about you want to say, because I realize we've been going longer than I normally go, and my list of questions is still there. So I'm going to have to try to talk you into coming back on the podcast again. But, thinking of the conversation we've had, is there any kind of final thoughts or something you want to button up? Or
let me just say first how thankful I am for this podcast and the things you're doing. I just think this is vital work, and I've enjoyed hearing the voices of theologians, many of whom I only know through their texts. And when you hear them give voice, that's very powerful. And I think that's the sort of thing that we need. I would love to come back. This has been a very stimulating conversation, and I encourage. I love debate, and I learn through it. So I don't. That said, I was willing to follow your lead. I appreciate the reading of the books. I will take with me the vision of you drinking and having fun with friends while you're doing it and giving them trouble. I think if I had one thing to say in the end is that there are so many different tasks that are important that so many people are pursuing. And my little one is to try to help people be able to, as I say, given, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, it's in the book, given given generally accepted standards of what's reasonable and good, living faith in God is wholly reasonable. And so being able to, even if you don't understand all the detail of the arguments, the idea that the way we're seized by the faces, not just of other people, but of all other creatures, that is manifesting a reality which is as immediate and real as gravity. Mm-hmm. It's in a different another sphere. We can resist it. We can harden our hearts to it. It doesn't exist unless we're there in a sense to manifest it and to explain it. But it's just as real. And not only that, but this is a sense in which the challenge of evil about salvation. It saves us from the spiritual challenge of evil, and it empowers us immediately to action. And that's what I hope to make reasonable a little bit. Let me say, because of who you are too. Let me do two things for you. You might cut this later. It goes to prior podcasts. Insofar as the essence of faith is consistent with Jesus' parable of the sheep of the goats, and where the distinction between sheep and goats is simply who sees and responds to the faces of others. It doesn't matter particular belief systems, which faith is other than beliefs. Then, for instance, the switch of the difference between Tony and Bart Campolo vanishes. There's still significant issues, but they're both sheep. And so, and the same would be said, you mentioned Gandhi earlier, and others. So this is a way of saying, not that the beliefs aren't significant, not that I'm not a Christian and that's significant, but this gives us a way of not allowing divides between, a secular humanist and an evangelical Christian, and a Christian and a Buddhist and a Hindu and a Muslim, etc. This allows us to appreciate the diversity of those belief systems, even as we can celebrate and work together on what I think is the same divine reality seizing us all. And then the second thing is I'm not a process theologian, but I know you are passionate about process theology. For me, it's largely a question of biography. I have some differences from process, but I think that's a very interesting question for me. And I mean intellectual biography. And the process theologians I know, and I think of Jay McDaniel and John Cobb and Catherine Keller, I mean, no one cannot respect and reverence theology that these people are putting forward. I expected a question on process from you. It didn't get it. So I wanted to throw that out there because in many ways I'm very close to that process thought and appreciative, but in some other ways there's some differences.
Well, so. I actually thought taking Levinas, getting rid of the asymmetrical bit and recognizing agape as a sphere of reality makes him much more compatible with kind of a larger kind of process metaphysics in general than
there's tremendous, and I just don't know, this is an area for exploration for me. So anyway.
Well, I know that if I hadn't taken a summer class at Claremont because I read a process book after getting told you sound like a process philosopher in a class, and that's not compatible with Christianity. So then I just went and got books out of the library, read it, liked it. And I went there. I found there's a 1-week summer class with John Cobb at Claremont. So I talked, Alicia's like, hey, it's vacation. And then I met him and he's like the nicest, most amazing person. And so I'm like, yeah, if that's their favorite, I like that guy. If I end up that way, this is good. And though I've been told I just turned in, I just turned in my dissertation, edits and everything, and
congratulations!
I have my defense in 2 weeks. And one of the committee members has told me my Christology in it is significantly high. That I may not count as process anymore. And
well, I think you could go with that. I had a professor. It was should I say this because it's a quote? I think it's rough. It was Anyway, he was a student of Paul Tillich's, and he did his dissertation with Tillich. And he said the advice Tillich gave him on his dissertation was he was doing a thinker, to get to know that thinker so well that you just thought the way that thinker thought, and you argued the way that thinker argued, and you thought they were right about everything, and then rebel. And so I thought that was interesting, good advice. And so it sounds like you might be following that. It's important, though, whether you rebel before or after the dissertation defense. Well, depending on your committee.
Yeah. Though you mentioned kind of that you learn a lot from Levinas because of him developing a vocabulary, and I think that's the same thing's true about Whitehead. That guy, I mean, you have to have a dictionary. Does just Whitehead words to really follow it. Like I was into it before I took a PhD seminar on process, and by the time I got done, I was like, I don't even know what I was thinking before.